The envelope was under the maple leaf magnet on the refrigerator, tucked there so carelessly that at first Elowen Hart mistook it for one of the library flyers she sometimes brought home and forgot to throw away. It was a wet Thursday evening in Portland, the kind of rain that did not fall hard enough to feel dramatic, but stayed long enough to make the whole city seem tired, coating windshields, darkening sidewalks, turning porch lights into blurred yellow circles behind glass. Elowen came home after closing the community library late because a children's reading circle had run over, and one of the older patrons, Mr. Halpern, had lost his bus card and insisted on apologizing for 20 minutes while she helped him find it in the pocket of his raincoat. By the time she pushed open the front door of the house in the quiet suburb west of the city, the hem of her coat was damp, her shoulders ached from carrying a tote full of returned books, and the house smelled faintly of lentil soup she had left on the stove for Graham before leaving that morning. The kitchen light was on, not the bright overhead one, but the warm strip beneath the cabinets, the one she liked because it softened the old wooden counters and made the room look kinder than it felt. The dishwasher hummed behind its closed door. The wall clock above the pantry ticked with the small stubborn sound of something continuing because no one had told it to stop. Upstairs water was running in the bathroom. Graham was home. That should have meant something. It still did, or at least her body still reacted as if it did, loosening slightly at the knowledge that the man she had married was inside the same walls, moving through the same evening, using the same towels, leaving steam on the same mirror. She set her tote on the chair, took off her shoes by the back door, rubbed one cold foot against the other, and opened the refrigerator for milk. That was when she saw the envelope. White, unsealed, half hidden under the maple leaf magnet Sella had made years ago in a pottery class, glazed in red and orange because Elowen loved the Japanese maple outside their dining room window. The envelope had Graham's name printed on the front along with the name of a real estate agency she did not recognize, Mira Solano Residential. Elowen stood with one hand on the refrigerator door, cold air spilling over her wrist, the carton of milk forgotten on the shelf. For several seconds she did not touch it. There are moments when the body understands that paper can be heavier than furniture, heavier than walls, heavier than the roof above it. Finally she slid the envelope free, opened the folded pages inside, and saw the address of their house at the top, followed by estimated market value, comparative listings, recommended preparation, suggested staging priorities, and beneath that, in neat black text, a note that seemed to remove the kitchen floor from beneath her feet. Potential listing timeline: late spring. Appointment completed. Owner present, Graham Hart. Elowen read the line once, then again. She heard the shower upstairs turn off. She heard the pipes knock gently in the wall. She heard a car pass outside, tires whispering over wet pavement. Nothing in the house changed. The soup was still in the pot. Her coat still hung from one shoulder. The refrigerator still beeped softly because the door had been open too long. But something had moved, silently and finally, from suspicion into fact. Graham had invited someone into their home to imagine it without them. No, not without them. Without her knowing. He had let a stranger measure the rooms, judge the light, estimate the price of the floors she had scrubbed, the kitchen she had painted, the window where she had placed herbs every spring, the bedroom where she had spent whole nights awake beside the turned back of a man who said he was only tired. The house was still legally theirs. Her name was still on the mortgage, still on the tax statements, still on the insurance forms she renewed every February. But as Elowen stood barefoot in the kitchen with the cold refrigerator air touching her hand, and Graham's shower steam drifting down from upstairs, she understood that ownership and belonging had never been the same thing. 12 years earlier, the house had been ugly in small forgivable ways, which was why Elowen had loved it immediately. The porch paint was peeling in long curls, the kitchen cabinets were too dark, the upstairs hallway smelled faintly of damp plaster, and the basement had a corner where rainwater gathered during heavy storms. The real estate agent had tried to apologize for the narrow pantry and the old furnace. But Elowen had walked into the dining room and stopped because of the window. Outside it stood a Japanese maple, its branches delicate and uneven, red leaves trembling in October light like small open hands. Graham had watched her face before looking at the tree, and he had smiled in the way he used to smile then, not as a performance, but as if her happiness had reached him before she spoke. They were younger, not young exactly, but young enough to mistake exhaustion for ambition and a mortgage for proof that the future had chosen them back. Graham was just beginning to build a reputation as an interior architect at a small design firm. Elowen was not yet library manager, Only a program coordinator who stayed late shelving books, repairing torn picture books with clear tape, and planning free workshops for families who needed warm rooms in winter. They signed the papers with hands that trembled from fear and excitement, then spent their first night eating greasy pizza on the living room floor because the table had not arrived. Graham used an upside-down cardboard box as a tray and sketched ideas for the house on the back of a moving receipt. He would build shelves along the living room wall, he said, real ones, not cheap floating boards. He would turn the smallest bedroom into a reading room for her, with a low chair and a lamp and a window seat if he could make the measurements work. He would sand the old kitchen cabinets and stain them lighter. They would plant rosemary by the back steps. They would get a dog someday, maybe a mutt with nervous ears. They would host winter dinners where friends brought bread and wine and nobody cared if the floorboards creaked. Elowen had listened to him and believed, not because the plans were grand, but because they were shared. That was what made them sacred. A crooked house became beautiful when two people stood inside it and called the repairs hours. In those first years they worked in the house together. Graham painted with his sleeves rolled up, a streak of gray primer across his jaw. Elowen labeled boxes in careful handwriting, fiction winter coats, kitchen extra photographs. They argued gently over curtain colors, laughed when the kitchen faucet sprayed sideways, slept on a mattress on the floor during the week the bed frame broke, and spent one entire Saturday trying to move a second-hand bookcase through a doorway that was half an inch too narrow. When it finally scraped through, Graham lifted both hands like a man who had won a championship, and Elowen laughed so hard she had to sit down on the stairs. There were real things then. She would never deny that later, even when denial might have made leaving easier. Graham had once loved the house with her. He had once known how to turn toward her with a question instead of away from her with a plan. He had once drawn sketches not of escape, but of rooms they would live in together. That truth would become one of the cruelest parts of the story, because nothing hurts quite like discovering that something real can still die without announcing the exact day it stops breathing. The death of the marriage did not enter the house like an intruder. It came in as quiet maturity, as busy seasons, as tired evenings, as reasonable boundaries, as the ordinary thinning that people warned might happen after years together. Graham did not become cruel in a way Elowen could easily show anyone. He still made coffee if he was up first. He still asked whether they needed milk. He still mowed the lawn on Sundays, though he began wearing noise-canceling headphones, so he would not have to hear the neighbor Ansel call over the fence about tomatoes or weather, or the raccoons tearing through compost bins. He still sat across from her at dinner, though more often with his phone face down beside his plate, one finger resting on it as if expecting the private world inside to pulse. He still kissed her temple when guests arrived and stood behind her chair at dinner parties, with one hand briefly touching her shoulder, just long enough for other people to see a marriage that looked intact. But after the guests left, after the wineglasses were rinsed and the candles blown out, he would say he had a deadline, or his head hurt, or he needed to think through a spatial problem for a client, and he would disappear into the upstairs office that had once been her reading room. At first, Elowen accepted this with the loyalty of someone who believed love was not measured by constant intensity. She worked at a library. She believed in preservation. She believed in quiet maintenance, in structures that lasted because people cared for them even when they were no longer new. She thought perhaps marriage was like the old books in the local history room, spines softened, pages brittle, still valuable because someone kept them out of direct sunlight and repaired the torn places before they spread. So she maintained. She folded the towels in the bathroom the way they both liked. She replaced the burned-out bulb above the stove. She made soup in winter and peach cobbler in August. She wrote both names on holiday cards even when Graham had not chosen a single card in years. She kept the family calendar updated with Briar's birthday, Helena's checkup, Ansel's block party, Cella's pottery show. She lit candles on Fridays because they had once decided Friday dinners would be phone-free, even though Graham now checked messages in his lap and called it a habit he was trying to break. She told herself the rituals mattered even if he only half entered them, because perhaps a ritual was a door and perhaps one day he would walk through again. Yet the house began collecting evidence against her hope. The dining room chairs on Graham's side gathered no scratches because he rarely pulled them out except when guests came. The reading lamp in the living room became hers alone. The kitchen radio played the classical station she liked because Graham said music made it hard to concentrate, although he rarely stayed long enough to listen. Their bedroom held 2 nightstands, but only hers carried books, hand cream, receipts, loose earrings, signs of ordinary human settling. Graham's side grew sparse, controlled, almost hotel-like, a phone charger, a water glass, one architecture journal placed square with the edge. He was not gone. That was the terrible thing. He was everywhere in objects and nowhere in presence, his jacket on the hook, his mug in the sink, his shoes by the back door, his body beside hers in bed, his mind elsewhere behind a door she had not been told existed. Sella Vance noticed before Elowen let herself notice. Sella had been Elowen's closest friend since their 20s, a potter with strong hands, silvering hair, and a face that could look both kind and unimpressed at once. She lived alone after a divorce she rarely dramatized, in a small house filled with clay dust, mismatched bowls, and plants that looked half wild because she believed things grew better when not constantly corrected. One November evening she came over carrying a newly fired serving bowl glazed in storm blue, the kind of gift that seemed casual until Elowen turned it in her hands and saw how much care had gone into its weight. Graham was home when Sella arrived. He greeted her warmly, complimented the bowl, poured wine, and asked 2 questions about her studio with the correct amount of attention. During dinner, he told a story about a restaurant redesign his firm was pitching, explaining how light could make people feel welcome or exposed depending on the angle. Elowen watched him speak and felt the familiar ache of seeing how alive he could still become around ideas and strangers. Halfway through the meal, his phone lit beside his plate. He glanced at it, turned it over, then looked at Elowen. "I need to respond to this after dinner," he said. 10 minutes later, while Sella was describing a kiln malfunction that had ruined 3 large pieces, Graham stood with practiced regret and said he had to look at a client file before morning. He took his wineglass, touched Elowen lightly between the shoulders as he passed, and went upstairs. The office door clicked shut. Sella continued speaking for another minute, but something in her gaze had sharpened. Later, while they washed dishes, Sela dried the blue bowl she had brought and set it gently on the counter. "Does he always leave like that?" she asked. Elowen's hands stilled in the soapy water. "He has a lot of deadlines." "That is not what I asked." Elowen gave a small laugh, the kind used to soften a room before truth could become impolite. "He works differently than I do. He needs quiet to think." Sella looked around the kitchen, at the warm lights, the folded towel, the soup pot soaking, the calendar with colored marks in Elowen's handwriting, the small plant cuttings lined along the window. "Do you realize every sign of life in this house belongs to you?" Elowen frowned, not angry yet, but close to it. "That is not fair." "I did not say he owns nothing, I said life. There is a difference." Elowen rinsed a plate harder than necessary. "He is not expressive." Sella leaned her hip against the counter. "There are people who are quiet because that is how they rest. And there are people who are quiet because it lets other people keep guessing instead of asking. I do not know which one Graham is. But I know you are doing a lot of guessing." Elowen wanted to dismiss it. She wanted to say Sella's divorce had made her suspicious, that living alone had made her too proud of independence, that every marriage looked strange from the outside. Instead, she said nothing, because from upstairs came the faint sound of Graham's office chair rolling across the floor, and for the first time the sound did not seem like work. It sounded like distance being practiced. After the envelope, Elowen did not confront Graham immediately. This surprised her. She had imagined, in the abstract, that if she ever discovered something truly wrong, she would become the kind of woman who demanded answers at once, who placed evidence on the kitchen table and refused to let the night continue until truth entered the room. But the body has its own forms of shock, and Elowen's shock made her precise. She folded the appraisal papers back along their original creases, slid them into the envelope, and placed it on the counter instead of back under the magnet. She closed the refrigerator. She poured the milk. She heated the soup. When Graham came downstairs in soft clothes, hair damp from the shower, smelling of cedar soap and steam, he glanced at the envelope, then at her, and she watched his face adjust so quickly that someone less fluent in his small changes would have missed it. He did not look guilty. He looked inconvenienced by timing. "Where did you find that?" he asked. Elowen set his bowl on the table. "On the refrigerator." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I meant to put it in my office. I can see why." He sat down slowly, as if choosing calm on behalf of both of them. "It is not what you think." She almost smiled because that sentence had always struck her as strange. People used it when what someone thought was usually very close to what had happened. "What do I think?" Graham looked at the papers. "You think I am making decisions without you." She did not sit. "Are you?" he exhaled. "I had the house evaluated. That is not a decision. It is information. Information about our house." "Yes." Collected by a stranger you invited here while I was at work. His eyes lifted to hers. I did not invite her in like that. How did you invite her in? His mouth tightened. Elowen. There it was, her name used not with intimacy but as a warning to become reasonable. I have been thinking about our finances, about options, about whether it makes sense to stay in a house this size when we use half of it. We? She asked. His expression flickered. All right, when I use half of it. When you use certain parts and I use certain parts. You know what I mean. No, I do not. He leaned back. I did not want to worry you before there was anything concrete. The sentence was soft, almost considerate, and beneath it Elowen felt the first clear shape of his method. He had not excluded her, according to him. He had protected her from premature concern. He had not begun leaving. He had gathered information. He had not made a decision. He had explored options. He had not lied. He had waited for the right time to speak. You let a real estate agent walk through our house, Elowen said. You signed an appraisal form. You discussed a listing timeline. Graham's voice remained controlled. A possible timeline. Late spring, possible. It is February. Exactly. Nothing is immediate. She finally sat across from him. The soup steamed between them. How long have you been thinking about this? He picked up his spoon, then set it down without eating. A while. How long is a while? I do not know. Months. His eyes moved away from hers. That was when she knew months meant longer. The kitchen seemed to expand around them, every object suddenly bright with accusation. The calendar, the grocery list, the plant on the windowsill, the 2 bowls of soup, the maple magnet. The house had been carrying a conversation she had not been invited to hear. Graham looked at her with tired patience. You are making this heavier than it needs to be. Elowen stared at him, and for once did not answer quickly. She understood that if she raised her voice, he would make the raised voice the subject. If she cried, he would make the tears evidence that he had been right not to tell her sooner. If she pleaded, he would become sad and say he hated hurting her. So she asked, very quietly, what weight would you prefer I give to finding out my husband has been preparing to sell my home? He closed his eyes. Our home. No, she said. Not tonight. Tonight it feels like yours. The next discovery came from the room that had once been hers 4 years earlier. Graham had asked to use the small upstairs reading room temporarily because a project required more space for drawings. Temporarily became longer. A second monitor appeared, then storage tubes, then a lock on the door because he said client materials needed privacy. Elowen had accepted this too. She moved her chair to the living room, boxed some books, told herself marriage required flexible use of space. But after the appraisal, the closed office door seemed to change shape in the hallway. It no longer looked like a boundary around work. It looked like a border inside the house. One morning Graham left early and forgot to close his laptop. Elowen had gone in only to find the electricity bill. At least that was what she told herself as her hand turned the knob, and her body entered the room before her conscience finished objecting. The office smelled like paper, graphite, and Graham's coffee. Shelves lined the wall where her books had once been. His drafting table stood angled toward the window. On the laptop screen was a design file, open to a clean architectural rendering of a loft apartment. Not a client presentation, no company logo, no project number. The file name read, West End Option. Elowen stepped closer. The plan was detailed in a way that made her feel as if she had walked in on an affair, though there was no other woman in the drawing. Morning light exposure. Built-in shelf for architecture books. Dining table, 2 seats, 1 marked preferred. Bedroom storage minimal, no guest room, no garden access, no shared office, no second life accommodated. It was not just a drawing, it was a wish given measurements. Graham had imagined where the sun would fall in a home without her. He had placed furniture around a future that did not need to ask what she would read in the morning, where she would put the blue bowl Sela made, whether the windowsills could hold rosemary. The door behind her creaked slightly in a draft, and Elowen turned as if caught. No one was there. The shame she felt then confused her. Graham had hidden the drawing, yet she felt like the trespasser. That was how private silence works in a marriage long enough. The person excluded begins to feel guilty for discovering the room from which they were excluded. She printed nothing. She sent nothing to herself. She only stood there, memorizing the words West End Option until they seemed carved behind her eyes. That evening Graham noticed her quietness at dinner. He had made salmon for himself and a vegetable tart for her, because he knew she was trying to eat less meat. This kind of detail still hurt because he was not careless in every direction. He could remember food preferences while forgetting to include her in the future. Long day, he asked. She looked at him across the table. I saw the loft drawing. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth. You went into my office. Yes, That room contains confidential client material. The file was not confidential client material. That is not the point. It is one of the points. His face hardened, not with open anger, but with disappointment, which he wielded more effectively. You invaded my privacy. You planned a private life inside our house. He set down the fork. That is a sketch. I sketch spaces all the time. You labeled the morning light, because that is how I think. You marked one chair. He looked away. For the first time, a crack appeared in his calm. It was small, quickly repaired. I have been trying to understand what I want. Elowen felt the sentence enter her slowly. Without telling me what you no longer want. Graham's voice lowered. I did not know how. So you learned how to draw it instead. He looked at her then, and in his eyes she saw something that was not cruelty exactly. It was worse in some ways. It was the exhaustion of a man who had already had the conversation alone, and resented being asked to repeat it with the person affected. You make things very hard to say, he said. The old Elowen might have received that as a flaw to correct. She might have softened her tone, invited him gently, made the room safer for his confession. But she was beginning to understand that Graham had been using her anticipated pain as a reason to deny her participation. No, she said. You make them final before saying them. The money had been leaving their life quietly for 3 years. Elowen discovered that through an email sent to an old joint address they both rarely used anymore, a statement notification from a bank she did not recognize. At first she assumed it was spam. Then she saw Graham's full name, logged in through the linked portal with the password he had once shared for household accounts, and found the savings account. It had been opened almost exactly 3 years earlier, under Graham's name only. Monthly transfers labeled Design Reserve. Occasional larger deposits after bonuses, a balance high enough for first and last month's rent in the West End, a security deposit, legal consultations, moving expenses, and the kind of cushion Elowen had thought they did not have. Her first reaction was not fury. It was arithmetic. She thought of the roof repair they had delayed, because Graham said they should be careful until his firm's contract stabilized. She thought of the Vermont trip she had cancelled after pricing flights, telling herself the money would be better spent on replacing the basement dehumidifier. She thought of paying for her library management certification in installments, because she did not want to strain their budget. She thought of buying store-brand detergent, packing lunches, postponing the dental crown her insurance only partly covered, trimming the holiday gift list, all while Graham moved money into a private future with the gentle regularity of a man watering a plant no one else could see. When she confronted him, he did not deny the account. Denial would have been too crude, he said. I needed something that was mine. They were standing in the basement because she had gone down there to check the fuse box, and he had followed after she sent him the screenshot. The basement smelled of dust, cardboard, and rain through concrete. Around them were the old boxes of their life, Christmas decorations, tax files, extra dishes, photo albums, Graham's college portfolios, Elowen's childhood books. Something that was yours, she repeated. He folded his arms. Yes, we have joint savings. Joint savings are for the house that you were appraising. That is exactly why I needed clarity. You needed escape. He looked pained. You keep choosing the harshest word. You keep choosing the softest behavior name for the hardest thing. His eyes moved over the boxes as if the past itself tired him. I felt trapped, Elowen. There it was. A word with moral power. Trapped. A word that turned the house she had tended into a cage, turned her confusion into the grip of a jailer. Did you tell me? She asked. I tried. When? In different ways. Name one. He was silent. Water clicked somewhere in the pipes. You do not understand what it is like for me to disappoint you, he said finally. She stared at him, and something inside her recoiled from the elegance of it. He had disappointed her privately for years, but he had made her visible disappointment the unbearable part. So you built a life where you could disappoint me all at once after preparing enough not to need my response. Graham's face closed. I am not going to keep standing here while you make me into a villain. The word villain would return often. Men like Graham protected themselves with it. If Elowen described harm clearly, she was accusing him of monstrousness. If she softened the description, he could avoid the harm. The choices were always too much or not enough. She looked at the boxes around them and realized she no longer knew which ones held shared memories, and which held props from a story Graham had already left. Briar Hart did not excuse her brother, which made Elowen trust her and resent her at the same time. Briar was Graham's younger sister, an occupational therapist with a calm voice and tired eyes, the kind of person who knew how bodies adapted to injury long before people admitted they were injured. She had always loved Elowen in a sisterly but careful way. never overly intimate, never false. When they met in a cafe near Briar's clinic, rain streaking the windows and the air smelling of espresso and wet wool, Briar already seemed to know why Elowen had asked. Graham said you found some things, she said. Elowen laughed once without humor. Some things. Briar wrapped both hands around her coffee. He told me you are having trouble accepting change. Elowen felt heat rise in her face. Of course he did. Briar looked down. I am not telling you because I believe it. I am telling you because you should know the story is already being shaped. Elowen sat very still. This was becoming familiar. Graham did not announce decisions to her, but he seeded interpretations elsewhere. By the time she reacted, her reaction would already have a frame. Did he tell you about the appraisal? Elowen asked. Not directly. The loft drawing? Briar closed her eyes briefly. No. The account? No. Elowen nodded. Then what did he tell you? Briar looked out the window. That he has felt alone for years. That you love the house more than the marriage. That he does not know how to talk to you without becoming the bad guy. The words landed with painful accuracy because each contained a fragment of truth sharpened into a weapon. Elowen did love the house. She had clung to rituals. She had made it hard sometimes by wanting conversations when Graham wanted retreat. But the larger truth had been removed. When Graham was a child, Briar said slowly, he never said no when no would hurt someone. He just made the thing impossible later. He did not tell Dad he hated soccer. He forgot his cleats, missed rides, stopped turning in forms, until the coach said he should take a break. He did not tell Mom he was not applying to law school. He waited until he had already sent his architecture portfolio to 3 programs, then acted as if everyone should be proud he had found his own path. Briar looked at Elowen with real sadness. He calls it avoiding unnecessary pain, but what he really does is choose the point where no one else has room to respond. Elowen looked at the coffee she had not touched. Why did no one tell me this before? Briar did not defend herself. Because he is easy to feel sorry for. He looks trapped by other people's expectations even when he built the tunnel himself. That sentence stayed with Elowen for days. It did not make Graham evil. It made him legible. Sometimes legibility is more frightening than mystery, because once a pattern is named, every memory rearranges itself around it. The tiniest cruelty arrived through a text message Graham did not mean for her to see. His phone lay on the kitchen table while he stepped onto the back porch to bring in firewood, though they rarely used the fireplace anymore. The screen lit. Tobias Klein. You told her yet, or still living in the museum? Elowen saw the words before choosing to see them. Museum. A house where dead things were preserved, and visitors lowered their voices. Her hand hovered over the phone. She did not open it then. She let the screen go dark. But the sentence entered her body and began burning. That night, after Graham fell asleep beside her, with his back turned, breathing evenly, she took his phone from the nightstand. She knew the passcode because he had never changed it, another sign of trust or laziness or contempt disguised as openness. The thread with Tobias went back months, perhaps longer, but she read only enough to understand the shape. The marriage has been over in my head for years. The house is the only thing keeping us in the same sentence. Elowen loves the idea of us more than me. I keep waiting for a clean moment, but there is no clean moment with her. She makes every change feel like a death. I toured a loft. It felt like breathing. I know that sounds awful. Tobias had answered with soft male sympathy. You deserve a life that feels like yours. You cannot stay because she is attached to the museum. At one point, Graham had written, I am not trying to hurt her, I just need to exit without becoming cruel. Elowen read that line 3 times. Exit without becoming cruel. The cruelty had been outsourced to timing, to omission, to real estate forms, to hidden accounts, to conversations with friends. He wanted a clean departure from a mess he had made by refusing to speak while speech still mattered. She set the phone back exactly where it had been and went downstairs. The house was dark except for the small light above the stove. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the dining room window. Outside, the Japanese maple was bare, its winter branches black against rain. She wanted to scream then, but the house seemed trained against loudness. Instead, she took a sponge and began wiping the already clean counter. She wiped until her wrist hurt. The next day at the library, she moved through tasks with mechanical gentleness. She helped a boy find adventure novels because he had read all the dragon books and wanted something, with danger but not too much kissing. She showed an elderly woman how to enlarge text on the public computer. She answered emails about the spring literacy fair. She reshelved books in the local history section, aligning spines with more care than necessary. Inside her, sentences leaked. The marriage has been over in my head for years, still living in the museum, loves the idea of us more than me. She began to doubt herself because some of it might be true. Had she loved Graham or the version of Graham who belonged in the house she had built around him? Had she mistaken continuity for intimacy? Had the candles, the soup, the calendar, the holiday cards been acts of love or acts of preservation, pinning a dead thing in place because she feared the empty wall? This self-doubt became its own room, narrow and airless. Graham had betrayed her by leaving alone, but he had also left her with enough truth in his accusations to make anger difficult. That was one of his subtler powers. He did not need to invent falsehood. He only had to isolate a piece of truth from context and hand it to her like a mirror. June Mercer found Elowen in the staff break room 3 days later, sitting with a cup of tea gone cold and a stack of returned books untouched beside her. June was in her 60s, a senior librarian who had worked in public libraries long enough to understand that people revealed themselves most honestly in what they asked for help finding. She had a dry voice, kind hands, and a marriage behind her that she mentioned only in fragments. She poured coffee, looked at Elowen once, and did not ask what was wrong. That restraint nearly made Elowen cry. "My ex-husband lived with me 7 years after he left," June said, stirring sugar into her coffee. Elowen looked up slowly. June leaned against the counter. Not physically. Physically he was there. Ate toast at the table, read the paper, complained about the neighbor's dog. But the person who would have chosen anything with me was gone. I kept thinking the quiet meant we had become mature. It did not. It meant I was the only one still having conversations in my head. Elowen looked down at her tea. "How did you know?" June gave a small smile. "I did not know, not for a long time. I mistook a quiet house for a peaceful one." She took a sip of coffee. "Do not do that if you can help it." The sentence should have felt like advice. It felt like a diagnosis. Elowen went home that night and listened differently. The dishwasher hum. Graham's office door closing, the heat clicking on, his footsteps crossing the bedroom, her own spoon touching the bowl. Silence had layers. She had once heard these sounds as domestic calm, the private music of an aging marriage. Now she heard absence between them. A home should contain answers, disagreements, overlapping needs, irritations, repairs, interruptions, apologies, badly timed laughter. Their house contained one person asking questions internally and one person making decisions elsewhere. The next Thursday, Elowen came home early because a power outage forced the library to close at 3. She turned onto their street and saw a silver car in the driveway. The front door was open. For one wild second she wondered if something had happened to Graham. Then she stepped onto the porch and heard voices from the living room. Graham's voice, low. A woman's voice, professional and bright, with the right staging, especially if you reduce the personal items and let the dining room window carry the emotional weight. Elowen entered the house. Graham turned. Beside him stood a woman in a camel coat, holding a tablet and a small device for measuring light. Dark hair, careful smile. "Oh," the woman said. "Mrs. Hart, I am Mira Solano." Elowen looked at Graham. He did not move toward her. Mira glanced between them, and Elowen saw the instant she realized something was wrong. "I am sorry," Mira said. "I was under the impression you were both aware of the preliminary listing consultation." Preliminary, another soft word for a hard trespass. Elowen set her bag down on the chair. "I was not." Graham's face tightened. "Elowen, this is not the way to do this." "No," she said, looking around her living room, at the wedding photograph still on the wall, at the rug she had chosen after saving for months, at Mira's tablet glowing with images of rooms already translated into market value. "It really is not." Mira began to apologize again, but Graham interrupted with a strained laugh meant to rescue everyone from discomfort. "We have been discussing options. Timing caught up with us." Elowen turned to him. "No, timing did not catch up with us. I caught you." The room went cold. Mira looked at her tablet. The old floorboards creaked beneath Graham's shoes. Outside, rain tapped the porch railing. There are humiliations that happen in public rooms, and humiliations that happen in the place where you keep your spare blankets. This was the second kind, and it was worse. A stranger had been invited to imagine her life cleared, decluttered, staged, made ready for someone else, while Elowen was still buying soup ingredients for 2. After Mira left, Graham tried to turn the wound into a discussion about Elowen's fear of change. He did it in the living room, standing near the fireplace with one hand on the mantel, framed by the room he had already begun to leave. "This is why I hesitated," he said. "Because you attach moral meaning to objects." Elowen stared at him. "Objects, the house, the rug, the tree, the dining room table. You make them stand in for the marriage. And you make decisions about them without me. Because every practical conversation becomes emotional. It is my home. It is also mine. Then why am I the last person to know what you want to do with it?" He looked tired. and his tiredness still had the power to make her feel excessive. Because I knew you would hear selling the house as me erasing our life. Elowen's voice shook. Are you not? No, you drew an apartment without me. That was exploratory. You saved money without me. That was security. You told Tobias the marriage ended in your head years ago. His face went still. You read my phone. Yes, that is a violation. She almost laughed. Of course that is the violation you can name. His eyes flashed. Privacy matters. So does participation. He walked to the window, looking out at the maple. I have been lonely too. The words landed, and she hated that they mattered. She hated that she could still imagine his loneliness, because she knew the house had become heavy for both of them. She knew she had sometimes loved the rituals more fiercely than the person across from her. She knew there were nights she had asked him to talk when he was exhausted. Mornings she had filled silence with plans because silence frightened her. But he had taken their shared loneliness and turned it into a private exit. That was the difference. Maybe you were lonely, she said. But you had a plan. I had a grocery list. Graham looked back at her. Something like shame crossed his face, then vanished behind defensiveness. That is a cruel way to put it. It is a clear way to put it. He shook his head. You keep wanting a villain? No, Graham. I wanted a husband. The sentence did not explode. It simply entered the room and stayed. Later that week, Ansel Reed brought back the garden shears Elowen had lent him, and, with the innocent destructiveness of a neighbor who noticed more than he understood, mentioned that Graham's listing lady seemed very efficient. Elowen stood on the porch with the shears in her hand. You saw her before? Ansel looked embarrassed. He was 74, widowed and fond of harmless conversation until it stopped being harmless. Oh, I thought you knew. She came by maybe last month. Twice, I think. Graham had that long tube thing with drawings. Early morning, Thursdays maybe. I figured it was work. He smiled uncertainly, then saw Elowen's face and stopped. The timeline moved again, not one appraisal, not one consultation. A pattern of appointments arranged around her absence, around library hours, around the faithfulness of her schedule. Graham had not only left her out, he had used her reliability as cover. The locked office opened only after Elowen refused to keep sleeping beside the closed door. It happened on a Saturday afternoon after a morning of strained politeness so dense that even the house seemed to hold its breath. Graham made coffee. Elowen did laundry. He asked if she wanted to talk with a mediator. She said she wanted to see the office. He said those were separate things. She said they were not. He stood at the bottom of the stairs, one hand on the banister. There are client materials. Move them. You are not entitled to everything, I think. No, but I am entitled to see what parts of our life you have already boxed. He looked at her for a long moment, then walked upstairs. The key turned with a small metallic sound that seemed absurdly delicate for what it opened. Inside, the room was cleaner than she expected. Not chaotic, organized, that hurt more. Along the wall were cardboard boxes labeled in Graham's precise handwriting. G apartment, books to keep, sell documents, not needed. Elowen entered slowly. The air smelled like dust and packing tape. On the drafting table lay rolled drawings secured with bands. In one open box she saw architecture books, a lamp from his desk, a framed black and white print from a design conference. In another were things that belonged to both of them, or so she had thought. A folded map from their first road trip to the Oregon coast. The cracked photo frame from the year the bookcase fell during an earthquake tremor. 2 blue glasses they had bought at a street fair when they were too broke to buy the full set. A small wooden bird Graham had carved badly during a cabin weekend and given to her as a joke. The box was labeled not needed. Elowen knelt beside it. She picked up the map. The creases had softened with age. Graham stood near the door, arms crossed. Those were just things I was sorting. Sorting for whom? For the move, eventually. Which move? He rubbed his forehead. Do we have to do this with every object? She looked up at him. Yes, because apparently objects are where you put decisions before telling me. His face closed again, but this time she saw something else beneath it. Impatience. Not with her tone, not with the argument, but with the inconvenience of having to revisit an inner process he considered complete. He had already classified the map as unnecessary. He did not understand why her grief could reopen the category. We cannot keep everything, he said. No, we cannot. She placed the map back into the box, very carefully. But you did not ask what anything meant before deciding whether it belonged to the future. The future cannot be a storage unit for the past. The sentence sounded like something Tobias might approve. It sounded wise if one ignored the person being cleared out. Elowen stood. You have been rehearsing this for a long time. Graham's eyes sharpened. And you have been refusing to see what was in front of you. The words struck because they were partly true. She had refused. Not everything, not always, but enough. She had seen his door close and called it work. She had seen his separate moods and called them fatigue. She had seen the house become hers alone and called it care. That night she went to the basement and opened the old boxes. She spread photographs across the floor. Graham and Elowen painting the dining room, Graham holding up the warped porch board he had replaced. Elowen laughing with flour on her face during the first Thanksgiving they hosted, the Japanese maple newly planted, small and fragile, with both of them kneeling beside it in muddy clothes. She found cards Graham had written in the early years. Our house feels like a person when you are in it. I never knew rooms could miss someone until you worked late. Let us become old here and complain about the stairs, she cried then. Not because it had all been false, but because it had not. If it had all been false, she could have hated him cleanly. Instead, she had to mourn the living beginning and the dead ending at the same time. She pressed one card to her chest and finally let herself see her own part without accepting his version of blame. She had tried to make the house warm enough to lure him back. She had polished floors, cooked soups, hosted friends, kept calendars, replaced candles, watered plants, as if love were a climate she could maintain alone until he remembered how to breathe in it. She had confused tending with mutuality. She had made a chapel out of domestic labor and prayed in it by herself. The last dinner at the wooden table was her idea. Not because she hoped to save anything, although hope, like mold in an old wall, has a way of surviving in hidden damp places. She asked for one dinner without phones, without office doors, without Mira, Tobias, budgets, appraisals, or the word practical. Graham looked wary but agreed. Elowen made lentil soup, the same kind that had gone cold the night of the envelope, because she wanted the circle to close where it opened. She placed 2 bowls on the wooden table, with the small burn mark from their 3rd year, when Graham had set down a hot pan without a trivet and apologized for days until the mark became a joke. The dining room window reflected them faintly. 2 people facing each other with the dark outline of the maple behind them. For a while they ate. The sound of spoons against ceramic seemed too intimate. Graham finally said, "I never wanted to hurt you." Elowen looked at the soup. "I believe that." He seemed relieved for half a second. "But you did." The relief disappeared. He nodded slowly. "I know." "Do you?" "I know now." She looked at him. "When did the marriage end for you?" His hand tightened around the spoon. "I do not know." "Yes, you do." He stared at the table. "Not in a single moment. I did not ask for a single moment." He swallowed. "A few years ago, maybe. During the winter your mother was sick. Or after. I felt like we became caretakers of routines. I did not know how to come back from that." Elowen's chest tightened. That winter had been brutal. Her mother's surgery, Graham's project deadlines, the roof leak, the library funding cuts. Elowen had thought they were surviving. Graham had been leaving. "Why did you not tell me?" "Because you needed the house to hold. I needed you to speak. You were grieving. You were exhausted. Every conversation felt like it would break something. So you let me keep carrying the breakable thing." His eyes shone, not enough to become tears but enough to make him look younger. "I stayed." The word stunned her. "You stayed?" "Yes, you lived here." "That is not nothing." "No, it is not nothing. It is furniture. It is not marriage." He flinched. She almost apologized for the harshness, but the apology did not come. Graham looked toward the kitchen, then back. "I thought if I stayed physically, it counted for something while I figured out the rest. And what was I during that time?" He did not answer. The silence was long enough for the refrigerator to click on in the kitchen. "Graham." He looked at her then, and in his face she saw the truth before he said it. "You were home," he said. The sentence entered her like a blade wrapped in velvet. It was beautiful, almost. It was also the whole crime. To him she had become home, not as a person with a right to choose, but as a place that stayed warm while he wandered inwardly elsewhere. A place to return to resent, to rely on, to leave when ready. Elowen nodded very slowly. "I was home," she said, "and you were a man planning to move." The payoff did not happen in a courtroom or a screaming fight. It happened during a private showing Mira arranged for a couple relocating from Seattle, a pediatric surgeon and a software engineer with a toddler who kept touching the doorframes. Graham wanted Elowen to skip it. "It will be easier if Mira handles it," he said. "Easier for whom?" she asked. He did not answer. She attended anyway. By then they had agreed to list the house because the legal and financial reality had moved past sentiment. Mira, now careful with both of them, had learned to copy Elowen on every message. The house had been cleaned beyond recognition, personal photographs removed, kitchen counters cleared, books reduced, the blue bowl cella made packed away. The dining room looked larger without the old sideboard. The living room looked brighter without the framed wedding photo. The house had been staged into a version of itself that seemed to have no memory of anyone suffering inside it. Graham arrived in a gray coat, composed, his politeness polished to a fine edge. The couple admired the light, the woodwork, the maple outside. The toddler crawled beneath the dining table and laughed. The surgeon asked, "Have you lived here long?" Graham smiled. The public smile that once made Elowen feel protected and now made her feel erased. 12 years. We have had many good years here. It was such a small word. A word he had abandoned in practice and returned to for presentation. Elowen looked at the window, at the place near the refrigerator where the envelope had been, at the stairs leading up to the locked office, at the dining table where he had said she was home. Mira glanced at her, perhaps sensing the shift. Graham continued, "We are just ready for a new chapter." Elowen heard herself speak before deciding how sharp the words would be. "He is ready for a new chapter," she said. The room fell quiet. The couple looked uncomfortable. Graham turned toward her slowly. She did not raise her voice. That mattered. She wanted no scene, no theatrical revenge, no proof for him that she was unstable. "This house was kept by one person who believed it still belonged to two people," she said. "The other had already begun leaving. If you buy it, you should know it is a good house. It holds warmth very well. Sometimes, even after the warmth is gone." No one spoke. The toddler crawled out from under the table, sensing adult stillness. Graham's face had gone pale. "Elowen," he said softly, the old warning. She looked at him. "No, not we, not anymore." Mira lowered her tablet. The couple murmured something about taking another look upstairs, grateful for escape. Graham stepped closer when they left the room. "Was that necessary?" he asked. She looked at the empty space where their wedding photo had hung. "Yes, you humiliated me." "No, I stopped agreeing to language that humiliated me quietly." He stared at her, and for once there was no elegant answer. The mask did not shatter. Graham was not that kind of man, it simply failed to cover enough. From that day on, he stopped saying they had mutually decided. Mira stopped using phrases like "both parties are exploring." Emails became precise, lawyers became involved. Breyer called Elowen and said she was sorry, not for Graham only, but for the family tendency to make silence look noble. Tobias sent a short message, awkward and insufficient, admitting he should have told Graham to speak to his wife instead of treating her like a sentimental obstacle. Elowen did not reply. Apologies that arrive after structural damage are not useless, but they are no longer beams. They cannot hold the roof. Packing the house was less like dividing property than excavating two different marriages. Graham wanted the drafting table, the brown leather chair from the living room, several architecture books, the clean-lined knives he rarely used but admired, the framed print from the hallway, and a set of ceramic plates he said had always suited his taste. Elowen took the small porch table, Sella's blue bowl, her mother's knitted blanket, the old library stool, most of the cookbooks, and the box of photographs he had marked not needed. They argued about smaller things than the marriage deserved. A brass lamp, a serving platter, the ladder, the record player. Each disagreement revealed a hidden geography of meaning. Graham wanted objects that represented a curated version of the life, the pieces that would look right in the West End loft. Proof that he had not discarded everything, only refined it. Elowen wanted things that bore use, damage, touch. The chipped mug from the first year. The towel with the burned edge from the kitchen fire that never became a fire because she smothered it fast. The garden gloves stiff with old dirt. When they reached the Japanese maple, there was nothing to divide. It stood outside the dining room window in early spring, buds just beginning to darken at the tips. Graham said almost gently, "The tree belongs to the house." Elowen stood beside him, looking at the branches. "No," she said, "it belongs to the ground. I was the one who thought it belonged to us." He turned to her, perhaps hearing the change. She did not cry. Crying still happened, but not always when expected. That was one of the signs that grief had moved deeper. On the last night, Graham slept at the temporary apartment he had rented before the sale closed, and Elowen stayed alone in the house. The rooms were nearly empty. Without rugs and books, the sounds changed. The refrigerator hummed too loudly. The stairs creaked like someone crossing them, though no one did. Rain touched the roof with a soft, persistent tapping, and in the basement the old pipes clicked as they cooled. Elowen walked room by room, not romantically, not in a montage of gratitude, but like a witness verifying a scene. Here was the living room where Graham once held her after her mother's funeral, awkwardly but sincerely. Here was the kitchen where she found the appraisal. Here was the staircase where he had sat years ago to tie her shoe when her ankle was sprained, and she was too proud to ask. Here was the office where her books had been replaced by his exit. Here was the dining room where she had served soup to a man who had already designed morning light elsewhere. Nothing was simple. The house had held love, the house had held neglect. It had held both without resolving them. That was what houses did. They did not choose meaning. People poured meaning into them and later suffered when the walls refused to testify cleanly. Before sleeping, Elowen placed Graham's old house key on the kitchen counter beside the first appraisal envelope. She had kept it, though he had newer keys, because it was the one he used when they moved in. Brass, scratched, ordinary. The envelope and the key looked small together, almost harmless, but they contained the beginning and the end of what she had learned. A person can have a key to a house and still not enter the life inside it. Graham came the next morning for the last few boxes. Sunlight had broken through after the rain, too bright for the emptiness. He stood in the living room with his hands in his coat pockets and said, "I will miss this place." Elowen believed him. That was the strange mercy and cruelty of it. Graham was not lying. He would miss the maple in October, the way afternoon light crossed the dining room floor, the porch during rain, the idea of having once belonged to something with history. But his missing would have corridors already built for it, the loft, the account, the life designed in advance. Her missing would be rawer, not because she loved more purely, but because she had been the last to receive the map. He looked at her. "Do you think someday we can remember it without this much pain?" Elowen looked at the bare wall where the wedding photograph had once hung. "Maybe you can." He lowered his eyes. "And you?" She thought of the museum, of home, of the grocery lists, of the candles, of the years when she was alone but not single, married but not included, housed but not sheltered. "I have to learn how to remember it without blaming myself for staying." Graham nodded. He did not reach for her. That was good, or sad, she could not tell anymore. They signed the final sale papers 3 weeks later. The house went to the couple from Seattle, who sent a polite note through Mira saying they loved the tree. Elowen read that and did not cry until evening, when she found one last red maple leaf pressed inside an old cookbook she had packed without checking. 1 year later, she lived in a smaller apartment near the library, on the second floor of a brick building where rain hit the street trees and buses sighed at the curb. There was no porch, no basement, no dining room window framing a Japanese maple. The kitchen was narrow, the heating uneven, and the upstairs neighbor walked heavily after midnight. But every object in it had been chosen by her. A low bookshelf, a round table with one regular chair and one spare for Sella, rosemary in a clay pot on the sill, the blue bowl on the counter, her mother's blanket folded over the couch. She paid bills from one account. She bought groceries for one person without feeling the ghost of a second appetite in the list. Some nights the apartment felt peaceful. Some nights it felt like a verdict. Graham emailed in early spring to say he had bought the West End loft and hoped she was finding steadiness. She read the email twice. He wrote kindly, carefully, with no obvious manipulation, and that unsettled her because part of her still wanted him to be worse than he was. It would have made the story easier. She closed the laptop without replying that day. Later, she printed a photograph she had taken on the final night in the house. The empty kitchen under yellow light, the appraisal envelope on the counter, Graham's key beside it, the dark window reflecting no one. She framed it simply and hung it near her apartment door. Not to remember Graham, not to worship the pain, not to turn the old house into a shrine, she hung it because she needed a witness that did not soften with time. A reminder that home was not proved by shared paperwork, matching keys, holiday cards, or a body sleeping on the other side of the bed. Home required participation. Home required being told before the appraisal, before the account, before the loft drawing, before the friend knew, before the stranger measured the light. Home required that no one quietly leave while letting the other person keep the lamps on. Elowen survived, but survival did not make her whole. It made her more exact. She no longer trusted quiet automatically. She no longer mistook a closed door for someone thinking. She no longer believed that 2 names on a deed could save a marriage from becoming one person's museum and another person's exit route. On rainy nights, when the apartment windows blurred and the city lights ran together, she sometimes missed the house so sharply she had to sit down. She missed the tree, the creaking stairs, the first pizza on the floor, Graham's younger face under primer dust, the version of herself who believed shared walls meant shared life. But she did not miss being the only one speaking inside the word us. That was the cold truth she carried forward. The house had still been theirs until the papers changed. The marriage had belonged to Graham alone for years, because he had taken the power to end it privately and left her with the chores of keeping it warm. In the apartment, Elowen lived alone, and the loneliness was clean enough to name. It did not pretend to be partnership. It did not ask her to water a dead thing and call the greenness memory. It simply waited with her, honest and bare, while outside the Portland rain kept touching the glass, and no one in another room was silently planning a life without telling her.